What's going on YouTube? Welcome back to No Lift Garage. I'm Gartrell, and today we're going to talk a little bit about whether or not you should be buying a Porsche 911 in 2025. So with the recent rise in popularity of Porsches, there's a lot more people trying to get into one more nowadays. So what I want to do is try to create a guide on whether or not you should actually be buying a Porsche 911. Now, what I think is not going to determine whether or not you actually go and buy one, but I hope that this video at least gives you the information you need to make an informed decision about buying a 911. So first thing I want to talk about is obviously cost. The cost of a Porsche could range anywhere from $20,000 all the way up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now the car that you decide to go with all depends on your personal preference. This goes to use of the car, styling, potential problems for the car and what you're willing to deal with and pay for. And this is all going to factor into which car you end up getting. There's also a lot of different feels from different Porsches. Turbos feel a lot different from all-motor Porsches. GT cars feel way different from a regular Carrera or a turbo. All of that is going to be factored in when you decide to purchase whichever Porsche you would like. So the cost of a Porsche, I'm not going to speak on. However, we can talk about some of the costs to mod a Porsche or costs to maintain a Porsche. For example, I'll give you some of the things that I've spent money on this car. Starting with maintenance, for example, the rear main seal when I first bought this car was leaking. I had to get that repaired. Dropping the transmission was about $2,500. Changing spark plugs and coil packs in that same service period cost a few $100s. Having a leak fixed on the transmission cost several $100s. All in all, I spent around maybe $5,000 getting an Ellen engineering kit put into this car, rear main seal being done, and other maintenance items that you would have done to this car in that type of a service. So that could be a deterrent for some people. $2,500 replacing a rear main seal is a decent amount of money. $2,500 to replace a clutch, which is typically the same service, costs a lot of money. Therefore, you have to factor in how much it costs to maintain a Porsche. Things like brakes can easily be in the thousands of dollars, just for the rotors. Maintenance items such as tires, maintenance items such as sounded pretty good. Now, how much you're willing to do by yourself? That's definitely like I don't know if you guys can hear that, but that's definitely a Porsche. It sounds like a flat six. That sounded really good. Maybe they're coming over here. That would be awesome if they did, but we'll see. And then even something as tires such as Michelin Pilot Sport 4S's can cost almost $2,000 for a Porsche. So when considering whether or not you're going to buy a Porsche, you should understand that this comes with a Porsche tax. There's going to be some repairs that are in the thousands of dollars. If something ever went wrong with the engine such as this, repairing it would cost anywhere from $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 depending on what is wrong with your car. This is something you have to understand when buying these cars. They are great for staving off depreciation. This is true. However, maintenance and breakdowns can cost you significantly. So I think it is very important to do your research when deciding A, what kind of Porsche would I like, B, what kind of things go wrong on the Porsche that I want, and C, can I afford to do repairs and mods to those cars if something were to go wrong. Now, just as easily, we can talk about the cost to mod a Porsche. In a few of my videos, I talk about some of the things that are done to this car, including the wheels, the bumper, the headlights, and tons of other things that have been done to this car. All of that costs several hundreds to thousands of dollars. I spent well over $15,000 in mods in this car, and to some people, it might seem like not much is actually done to the car. So just to name a few things in their prices, the wheels cost around $3,000 for the set, and again, around $2,000 for tires. The headlights cost $1,800. The bumper, unpainted, costs $2,000, $700 to paint it, another couple $100 just for the lip. The reason why I don't have an exhaust is because if I get an off-the-shelf option, it costs anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000. It is not cheap to mod a Porsche. You have to take that into account. So the cost is probably one of the biggest factors of whether or not you should consider buying a Porsche. Can you actually afford it? A lot of people choose to garage these cars. Can you afford to store your car? A lot of people don't like to have their Porsche sitting out in the rain and sun. I also garage my car, and this costs, a few $100s a month. So really factor in A, what do I want this car for? B, is the model that I'm buying sustainable? Can I fix it? Can I mod it with the money that I have? Also, you want to consider the model you're buying might not have the same depreciation scale as some of the GT and turbo cars. Now, I think that a lot of the competition does depreciate poorly compared to the Porsche 911, such as BMW with the, F-Series cars, one of which I had, that is actually now to this day cheaper than this Porsche 911. So, as you can see, I bought a 2016 BMW M4 back in 2018 and had that car for several years, and now it is worth less than the Porsche that I have standing behind me from 2007. So I guess that speaks to the depreciation scale of Porsche. Now, one thing that we should talk about when it comes to whether or not you should buy a Porsche 911 is competition. There are other cars on the market, guys. I know Porsche has been in the public eye for quite some time, given the past 5 years, with the release of its 992 generation and the release of the infamous GT3 RS 992. But there are other cars on the market that you could buy for the same money or in the price range of such as a 997.1. Now, some of these cars include, obviously, BMW. The F-Series cars and G-Series cars are great cars. I think you get a lot of bang for buck when buying something like an F-Series car. I've had the F82 M4, and you can get into those cars for under $30,000 now, put $10,000 to $15,000 into them, and have an insane car from a looks perspective and from a performance perspective. So you can't really understate the fact that there are cars that you can buy other than a Porsche 911. Now, what would you get? There is Aston Martin in some cases, which costs around $40,000 or so compared to my 997.1. And then there's the Ferrari 458, the Lamborghini, the Audi R8 V10 or V8, depending on what you'd like. You could get a gated manual. You could even get a Ferrari 360 for the $60,000 to $80,000 range, sometimes even less depending on the condition. And with gated manual swaps and conversions being more and more prominent, you could even change an E-Gear 360 Ferrari to a gated manuals 360 Ferrari, which you could bang against the rev limiter of almost 8,000 on the highway. You can't do that in a Porsche 911. So I think it's really important to understand that there are other cars on the market, and you should really do your research before saying, I'm going to go for the Porsche 911. I think that they're great and fun and true driver cars, but there is a lot out there. So when considering whether or not you should get a Porsche 911, take a look at the market. Look at other cars that could have a lot more bang for buck, that might be cheaper to maintain on a cost basis, that might actually not have a terrible depreciation scale. Ferraris, I think, are only going up. And honestly, if I could afford a Ferrari 360, I'd probably get one right now. So definitely take a look at the landscape. Porsche isn't the only manufacturer, and though they're very, very popular on social media right now, that doesn't mean that you should just jump at one simply because everyone wants one. It's not for everybody. Depending on how you like to drive, you might like a really powerful car. These are not really powerful cars out of the gate. Typically having Carreras, Carrera 4Ss, Carrera Ss only pushing around 350 or so wheel horsepower. That's not a lot when you consider that you could get your doors blown off by some cars that are much, much cheaper. So if you're into racing or things like that, this car might not be for you. Next thing I want to talk about is what you would be using the car for. I think this is a really important thing to consider when buying a 911. So at the beginning of the video, I touched briefly on the cost of a car based on what you would use it for. But now talking a little bit more in depth about what that means is, do you want this car as a daily driver? Do you want it as a status symbol? Do you want it as a fun track car? Do you want something that's going to be used in racing? These are all the type of use cases that you could have for a Porsche 911. I would say that most of the people who have 911s just genuinely enjoy a very good driver car, but for some people that might not be what you need. For example, if you're into racing, if you want to have faster cars than other people, this might not be the car for you. Now, these cars typically only have anywhere from 330 up to around 400 or so wheel horsepower from the factory. Now, given the turbo versions could be upgraded to increase that horsepower number a little bit easier than other models. People are interesting. These cars typically don't make a lot of power, so if you're someone that's into racing or having like a more powerful car than someone else, this might not be the car for you. Carreras all the way up to GT3s typically carry horsepower ranges from 330 for a base Carrera version up to 475 for a GT3 version, and up to 500 or more with the Turbo and Turbo S models. Now, the Turbo and Turbo S models can be made to be very powerful with, ES motors and modifications to the turbo systems, and that could get you to those high horsepower numbers. However, this factors into whether or not you can buy the car. Turbo cars go anywhere from $150,000 all the way up to $250,000, and the cost to mod those cars costs tens of thousands of dollars, and maybe even more depending if you're having motor work or turbos done. Those cars making 1,000 horsepower could easily have well over $50,000 put into them. So if that's not something you could afford to spend to get those big horsepower figures, getting a different car, maybe like a C6 Corvette, M3 or M4 that you could put a few $1,000s into and make those bigger horsepower gains, those are the type of cars you should be looking at, not a Carrera. If you're into circuit racing, the 911 might not be the car for you. You might actually want to opt for a Cayman, which are technically, or what I've been told, are better on track having a mid-engine car as opposed to having a true rear-engine car like the 911. This is another thing that you want to factor in when deciding whether or not you should buy a 911. The next thing I want to talk about is an intangible, the symbol that this car is. I have met a lot of very cool people just owning a base Porsche 911 from 2007. While the car is in the leagues with other cars of $40,000 and even regular Hondas at this point in terms of price, it's crazy the amount of attention and notoriety that a Porsche brings. Just having one and hanging out with people who also have them introduces you to a whole new group of people, a whole different socioeconomic circle. I'm not rich by any means, but I have had conversations with quote-unquote rich people simply because of the car that I have, and that they have, just a common passion for Porsches. So I think that it could be a gateway to meeting very cool people, to meeting very connected people, and depending on what type of business you're in, for example, maybe you're in real estate, or maybe you sell cars, that could be your segue into having conversations with some of these people who have means to purchase your product, or that are just like-minded individuals all around. Another type of intangible is a type of attention that you get from police. This actually goes pretty unnoticed, I will say, compared to my BMW. I think, BMWs have been given kind of a bad rep recently, and I think that there's a class of car that evades the attention of police, like those higher end sports cars like Ferraris, sometimes even a Porsche or Aston Martins and things like that. And you kind of skate under the radar, honestly. I don't get pulled over. I've never been quote unquote profiled in a negative way for driving this car, and I think that is something that you should consider when trying to buy a Porsche 911 or other car. Something to consider when buying almost any car really is the type of attention it gets. People don't try to come up to me on the highway and weave through traffic. I think that was a very, very common thing when I was in my BMW. People would always think that I was squeeze bends or something like that, and that's not the type of driving I like to do, but it's the type of attention that a car can bring you. And the Porsche 911 is a type of car where people see it, it just associates you with traffic and other people in very different ways. And I think that it's a positive thing towards buying a Porsche 911 and something to consider when you're deciding whether or not you want to buy one. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Drop a like, drop a subscribe if you've made it this far. Comment down below, would you buy a 911 considering the things that I've talked about in this video? And let me know if there's anything else you would consider when deciding whether or not you would buy a Porsche 911. Peace out and see you in the next one.